Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to do a little video on parabolic knowing. What is parabolic knowing, you might ask? Well, maybe you haven't followed the channel so closely. Maybe you only watch some of the Jordan Peterson stuff and not some of the Vervaeke stuff. Well, I've been having this ongoing conversation with Mary and Mark and Manuel and John Vervaeke about John's 4Ps of knowing. We know propositionally, we know perspectively, we know in a participatory way, and I can never get all four of them. Perspectival, participatory, propositional, it'll bubble up. Oh, Mary and Manuel and Mark have been beating on the drum of parabolic knowing. What is that? It's sort of like parables, and I've talked about that in the sense of common sense, as local knowledge, and these little aphorisms and parables, and in Amusing Ourselves to Death, Neil Postman talks about these little aphorisms that we have. A stitch in time saves 9, and this is sort of how we know the world, because what we're always trying to do is adjust our map out there and our map in here. And it's very important for us because, again, our map in here is a low resolution map. The world is too large for us to actually be able to totally take in, so we're always doing this. Now, in the ongoing debate about science and belief, for a long time, and I have a chapter I want to read out of Marsden's book with respect to Christians on this. For a long time, and at the height of modernity, propositional knowledge, this is sort of a knowledge that comes at us from a monarchical vision, reached its ascendancy. But we're not terribly good observers of ourselves, and so in this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Matt RIdley, which I find a lot of these things interesting, but the part I'm going to play now, the focus isn't so much on the content of what they're arguing, although that's interesting, especially when we get to Jordan's little bit. It's something that many of you have heard again and again and again and again and again from Jordan. But what I'd like to pay attention to this time is how we are always implicitly mapping, and we are mapping parabolically. And Mary sort of set the stage with this when she was making these observations watching children, because Mary is a mother and a grandmother, and saying, the child sits down and says, Daddy is the knife and Mommy is the fork and I am the spoon. And you think, what does that mean? Yet we all sort of sense the baby's getting at something, or a child will say, boys are dogs and girls are cats. And well, what are they getting at? And where is this knowledge? And where does this knowledge come from? Why do we make these associations? And in fact, a good bit of the science that we talk about is, in fact, a whole lot of implicit parabolic knowing and mapping these things out in the world to our mental maps, and we find it convincing. So here, Matt RIdley is talking about some Adam Smith economics with respect to human psychology and how we do this. But again, there's interesting content here, but I want you to pay attention to the type. He is telling a story out there that we quickly recognize. And because we recognize it, we look at, okay, knife, fork, spoon. Oh yeah, we see this dynamic, we see this response, and then we map it and we say, okay, that's on us. This is sort of this parabolic way of knowing.
Actually, it turned out that they were closely related. This was to some degree a family thing as well. So actually, and in human beings, it isn't very common for me to say, look, you did me a favor yesterday, so I'm going to do you the same favor today. Well, what are the circumstances under which that's going to happen? I'm going to have too much food today and you're going to have too much food tomorrow. It's kind of doesn't happen very often.
So, right there's a little implicit parable in it, and we listen to him and we say, we compare that to our map of the world, and we say, oh yeah, that makes sense.
But we human beings have developed another form of exchange, which is far more powerful, which is, I've got more food than I need, you've got more water than you need, I'm thirsty, you're hungry, we'll come to a deal, we'll swap. So we'll swap different things at the same time rather than the same things at different times.
And that, as it'll go on, this is a powerful thing that we don't really find happening much in the animal kingdom. And as Jordan goes into this, it's going to go to some interesting places in terms of who we are and what we are.
And for me, that's the real insight into how human sociality and cooperation evolved. Now, I'm only here repeating what Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations about the butcher and the baker are not giving you bread and beer because they want to be kind to you. They're doing it to make a living. But they end up being kind to you, and you end up being kind to them by giving them money, which is what they want.
Well, I also thought that in some sense you made a deeper case than that too, talking about the human capacity to understand and envision the future. I mean, reciprocity requires the...
Now, this move about the future that Peterson makes about sacrifice, this wasn't one of the first things that I caught from him. I remember him making that quite strongly in his 2018 Easter messages, this is how we discover the future. And he goes into that. But now, again, what kind of knowledge is this? Certainly it's procedural. It's participatory. There's the P I forgot. It's participatory where we get into it, but it's also highly parabolic because in a sense the present and the future relate to each other parabolically. And we say, well, things will be the same today as they'll be tomorrow, and that assumption that we have about sort of a constant steady state universe is part of what all of this stuff is leveraged on.
The ability to view transactions across time. And so as soon as
again, to view transactions across time, when I watch, my dog certainly has a capacity for this. And in our family, we notice whoever's, say, feeding the dog will become the dog's favorite, and the dog will be more responsive to their call, so on and so forth. But of course, we're doing this at a much higher level.
Creature becomes aware of the future like we have, we can even engage in reciprocal behavior with our future selves. And that makes our self-interest a much more complex phenomenon.
And again, when you think of something like our future self, if you're thinking in terms of a world of objects, the future has no object. All you have in a world of objects is now. Well, how do we, in fact, move into the future? We do so imaginatively, and what is the basis upon which we make these movements? Well, it's sort of parabolically. Like today is a parable of tomorrow, and so we extend ourselves through that. And again, all the machinery that we're using for this is highly imaginative. It's all the exaptation. We see into the future, we say of ourselves.
So the future, like we have, we can even engage in reciprocal behavior with our future selves. And that makes our self-interest a much more complex phenomenon.
And it also makes the self a more complex phenomenon, and it sort of pushes back on the individualism, because before this, they've been making arguments about, well, we're evolved to, prioritize our family and blood ties and our species. And so you have this hierarchy of priorities, perhaps, that we'll have. But part of what's interesting and comes out of this little snippet of the conversation is the question of who are you? What are you? You say, well, I am this carbon creature encased in this squishy stuff that I call skin. And that's harabolically who you are, because when you think about who you are, you travel into the future. You live in the past. You are parabolically connecting with beings and creatures and even inanimate objects and drawing relations from them to improve your map in order to navigate this world and do so successfully.
I might define self-interest as the impulsive pursuit of pleasure, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable definition, perhaps when you're talking about animals. But the question immediately arises, pleasure over what time span and at what cost? And I'm compelled by my knowledge of the future to act in a way that doesn't betray my future self. And that's very much like
And again, I love the way he phrases that, because betray my future self. So we're thinking about, and of course we see this in movies all the time, we're thinking about ourselves in the future. Well, that's not an object. My future self is not an object, because the only self I always know is the now self. But do I always know it? No. You say, no, you don't always know it. You know your future self. Oh, okay. What kind of knowledge do I know my future self with? Parabolic knowledge. I have a parabolic relationship between myself now and myself in the future.
Acting so then I'm a collective that stretches across time as an individual, and I have to.
Now I'm a collective, and I'm a collective that stretches over time, and also I'm a collective that stretches out this way. And we get into Piaget and this equilibrated state idea, where I sort of extend myself, and we see this all the time with identity things. I'm a Christian, I'm this, I'm that, but we have all of these selves that are going out now. They're not creatures encased in skin, my future self. Well, I hope to be encased in skin in my future self, but even right now, my contemporary others, or my contemporary self via identity, goes out and out and out and out. And of course, in Christianity, you have all of this language. It's all built into the faith that we are part of the body of Christ. Well, what is that body? Well, the body is made up of many parts, and all of this knowing is parabolic.
To act in the best interests of that collective. And I don't think that's very different than acting in the best interests of other people. If I'm in my last book, I wrote about the morality that emerges from games. There's a neuroscientist who you might be familiar with.
And of course, well, what is my knowledge of other people? Well, my knowledge is sort of parabolic. It's this parable that I have of myself. Well, it's narrative, and once you get this idea of this parabolic knowledge, it just sort of keeps giving.
Familiar with Jaak Panksepp, who studied rat behavior in.
And of course, if you listen to Jordan Peterson enough, well, you know exactly what's coming.
Games. And he showed that if you pair two male juvenile rats together, the one with a 10% body weight advantage will pin the other almost 100% of the time. And you might say, well, what that demonstrates is that might makes right. The stronger.
Okay. So first, the question with the rats is, well, one with more body weight than the other. What do we do? Well, parabolically, we then extend that to ourselves, and we say, well, and maybe Manuel and Mark and Mary will jump all over me and say, no, you're taking this way out of context, and you're being far too broad about this. But maybe I've got their idea wrong. But notice that it's all of this sort of imaginative association by which, well, this is science. It's science that the one who has more body weight is more likely to win. Well, okay, yeah, more likely to win. But now we're talking about rats here, and we listen to Jordan talk about this stuff, and we very quickly just simply apply it to ourselves.
Animal wins. But if you pair them together repeatedly, after the first bout, the defeated rat, juvenile, has to be the inviter of play in the next match. So he'll invite the bigger rat.
So we've got a little parable here. We've got a little parable with rats. And what lessons are we learning? Now, there's a lot of relevance realization in here because, well, maybe the relevant thing would be if you have a long nose and a long tail and you walk on all fours, you can win fights better. Well, that's not the point that we're listening to. What is the point that we're listening to? Well, each parable sort of, if the parable is well told and if the parable is properly situated and contextualized, the knowledge will be transmitted. Now, it might be right, it might be wrong, it might be low resolution, it might be insufficient. All of those things are possible, but again, all of this is a way of knowing, and we say, well, this is science. Science is teaching us, and we think it's science because it's a story involving rats, and there's someone with a lab coat and someone with letters behind their name, and, well, okay, so now I must believe it because this is science. But again, the way we know this is parabolic, and that's why it has influence on us. And now there's a bunch of people out there that listening to this will say, I don't believe any of that evolutionary stuff, so what do I have to do with rats? Well, and then the parabolic knowledge is going to kind of get cut off by these other ways of knowing, by these other assertions. But again, it seems to me this is all parabolic.
To play. But over repeated pairings, unless the big rat lets the little rat win about 30% of the time, the little rat will stop inviting him to play.
Right.
So what happens is that you get an emergent...
And at this point, Matt RIdley's like, who's interviewing who here? Did I ask for a Jordan Peterson lecture? Surely they're available on YouTube. This is how you know Jordan's back to his old self, because he's doing what he's always done.
Morality, which
he was a parable of his present self.
Which is not the ability to win any given game, but the ability to repeatedly play a multitude of games. And there's something in that that's very much like what you wrote about in The Origin of Virtue, and something very much like a complex reciprocity, right? So where you store your good behavior in your reputation, essentially.
And again, I mean, you store your good behavior in your reputation. And when he says it, it's like, wow, that's so true. That's genius. But it's parabolic.
That's of great advantage.
Yeah, and there is this, very, very simple thing that was happening in the 1990s when I wrote that book, which was the people were playing the Prisoner's Dilemma game on computers and finding out which strategy worked. And the Prisoner's Dilemma game is...
And how does the Prisoner's Dilemma game being played on computers in the 1990s connect to me? Well, it's all parables.
Is simply...
And if you watch the rest of the video, it goes on and on and on and on. So this is me. Mary and Manuel have sufficiently colonized me, and maybe they'll move on from there and say, no, you're getting it wrong, and they'll recalibrate their colonization of me. But all of this way of knowing, it's all story. It's all, well, there's a story out there and a story in here, and I see a relevance. I have a relevance realization moment between those things, and I say, oh, yeah, that little story about the rats, I remember playing with my sister, and, if I kept beating her up, she never wanted to wrestle anymore, so sometimes I'd let her win, or I'd be playing Monopoly with my children, and I didn't lose enough at risk to content my wife, but anyway, so off we have with these little parables. And when it comes into the exaptation, I was thinking about this when I was driving around in my car and I was listening to this Fernando Ortega song. It's a rendition of an old hymn. And I was thinking about the type of language, the poetic language, imaginative language, and I was feeling the feels. And, I was thinking about the fact that, my goodness, how on earth are you going to invent a religion that can compete with something like this? Well, why this? Well, this is an old hymn based on poetry from, I should look it up a second. One of the beautiful things you can find about hymns is that there's stories connected to them. And on the internet, people have put together all of the stories with the hymns. And a lot of these people wrote a lot of hymns in the 18th century. Joseph Hart was born in London in 1712. His early life was involved in obscurity. Is it involved in obscurity, or is it just obscure? I'm involved in obscurity this afternoon. His education was fairly good, and from the testimony of his brother-in-law and successor in ministry, Jewin Street, the Reverend John, let's make the font a little bigger for my old eyes, being in denial about having to wear glasses. In Jewin Street, the Reverend John Hughes, his civil calling was for some time that he was a teacher of learned languages. His early life, according to his own experience that he prefaced in the hymns, was a curious mixture of loose conduct, serious conviction of sin, and endeavors after amendment of life. Died in 1768. Oh, I'd found more background with this. Must have been a different site. Anyway, the guy wrote a lot of hymns, and he was a big deal in his day, even despite his early participation in obscurity. Just look at, and this is so utterly common. There's almost no song where this isn't true, and just pay attention to what we do with ourselves when we sing something like this. Come ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore. What am I doing? Well, Jesus ready stands to save you. Well, where does he stand? Full of pity, love, and power, I will arise and go to Jesus. And the website's note that's probably something from Luke 15 and the parable of the prodigal son. But I will arise and go to Jesus. Well, of course, this is all narrative. It's imaginative. It's sort of a parabolic way. And driving around here in the 21st century, listening to Fernando Ortega sing this, I'm moved by this. Well, why am I being moved by this? Well, even saying that I'm moved by this, I'm being moved by my car. No, what do I mean I'm moved by this? My emotions are moved. What do you mean my emotions are moved? I don't see any moving parts. We all know what I mean. He will embrace me in his arms, in the arms of my dear Savior. Oh, there are 10,000 charms. All of this language it's participatory, perspectival, it's parabolic. Come ye thirsty, come and welcome. Well, I just got up and got my water bottle in the middle of the slide. If you're thirsty, have water. Well, what are you thirsty for? Again, this is all parabolic. And again, if you're one of the issues that I really want to continue to talk about, Tom Holland has done some interesting interviews, and Esther O'Reilly just wrote a piece on him that just came out. And Tom, basically, he's sort of a story Christian. He doesn't mind. He sort of identifies with the Christian atheist thing, because on one hand, he doesn't believe in God, yet he lives into the Christian story. And we sort of get that, but how does that work? And then you get into this question of, okay, what is a Christian? Well, if you can sort of live into this stuff, you can see how. I just had a conversation this morning with someone who worked in the prison industry in Canada, and talked about solitary confinement a little bit and how that's going away. Well, how on earth do people stand up to suffering and not lose their mind in all kinds of heinous things? Well, they don't lose their mind because what are they doing in their mind? Well, they're going to Jesus in their mind, and he will embrace them in his arms. Come ye thirsty, come and welcome God's free bounty, glorify true belief and true repentance, every grace that brings you nigh. Come ye weary, heavy laden, lost and ruined by the fall. If you tarry till you're better, you will never come at all. Feel him prostrate in the garden. On the ground your Maker lies. On the bloody tree behold him. Sinner, will this not suffice? Well, what are you doing? It's all this imaginative stuff. And even all of these atonement theories. Okay, you've got a guy hanging on a tree. How does that possibly relate to me? I'm preaching on the Transfiguration, the Lucan version, and you have to ask yourself, okay, so Jesus and his disciples go up to a mountain. While he's praying, he starts to glow, and very quickly they see two other guys that somehow they relate to Moses and Elijah, and some words are passed, and the voice speaks out of the cloud, and then Jesus is left alone, and they don't talk about it because they're all too scared and freaked out. Well, there's the story of the Transfiguration. What does that have to do with me? And when I think about the type of knowledge that we use to manage this world, I mean, whether it's Panksap and his rats, or it's working on Adam Smith stuff and reciprocity, and whether it's me going through time, my future self, or it's me via identity, American soldiers giving their lives for their nation. I mean, that's all. We have all these little parables, all these little stories that inhabit us, and we lean into it. Pleads lo, the incarnate God ascended. Pleads the merit of his blood. Venture on him, venture wholly. Let no other trust intrude. I will arise and go to Jesus. Here we are, we're getting up and we're not getting up. I will arise and go to Jesus. He will embrace me in his arms. In the arms of my dear Savior, oh, there are 10,000 charms. Just one hymn out of hundreds or thousands of them that are out there, but it's all this way of knowing. Now, someone might say, oh, but I can play those imaginative games with just about anything. Yeah, you can, but again, we're always checking against our maps because we're in a world awash with these little parables, and we're always looking and say, well, this one I believe and this one I don't. Well, what do I mean when I believe? Well, this one I lean into. Well, this one I act as if it's real. So just couldn't watch that video and not think about parabolic knowing and not see that, well, if any belief, any application of science to us seems to involve this sort of parabolic way of knowing. Now, maybe I have it all wrong. I am not a cognitive scientist. And when Mary sat down with John and I, and Mary sort of went through her argumentation, I was mightily impressed. And John said he was too, because, like, wow, Mary's really done her homework in terms of this cognitive science a lot better than I have. But it seems this is the machinery that we use, not just for religion, but for science. This is the machinery we use to make our way in the world. And quite obviously, this is a valid way of knowing. And so when they're on the TV telling you to put on your mask, it's parabolic knowing. No, it's science. No, it's still parabolic, because mask wearers are protected and don't spew viruses. And again, all of this stuff that we're saying spew viruses, it's all imaginative. We appropriate it in these tiny little pictures, and that's how it goes out. So I don't know if this video is worth anything, but I thought I'd make it. So here it is, and let me know what you think.